Okay, so it's 7 o'clock, time for our virtual event with Natalie Jenner, the author of the Jane Austen Society, a personal favorite of mine from this year. Natalie was born in England, raised in Canada, and graduated from the University of Toronto with consecutive degrees in English literature and law. She worked for decades in the legal industry and also founded the independent bookstore Archetype Books in Oakville, Ontario, where she lives with her family and 2 rescue dogs. A lifelong devotee of all things Jane Austen, the Jane Austen Society is her first published novel. You can connect with Natalie on her website. So, Natalie, thank you so very much for joining us today. And why don't we start by, if you want to tell us a little bit about the Jane Austen Society.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks so much for having me. And I'm very excited to be here. I was just speaking to you earlier about how much I love Philadelphia, and I have a story about that to share. Actually, it's a critical inspiration behind my book. My book is a work of historical fiction. It's completely made up in terms of the characters and the events, but it's based on a couple of real life happenings in England in the Second World War. And what I did was I took the fact that a real society first started exactly 80 years ago, this past spring, to try and save the cottage where Jane Austen lived and worked on all 6 of her major books. And they had trouble trying to raise the money. And then a local gentleman who was grieving the loss of his son during the Second World War bought the cottage outright and then donated it to the nation so they could set up a museum, which people now go in droves to see. So I took those facts and I wanted to create a story about 8 very different people. And I knew from the beginning it would be about 8 to 10. I wanted them to come from all very different backgrounds. And I wanted my book to deal with them at the end of World War II when they are coming out of the trauma and the loss, and they were going to have to start to figure out how to re-engage with each other and with life, and how they bonded over a shared love initially of Jane Austen, but just generally of books. And in the course of the story that I wrote, they too, these 8 very different people, all made up, start a society and try and save the cottage. And that's what's on my book, So that's the story. And so the book is about how books connect us. And so it's not just about Jane Austen or even primarily about her, but it's also about finding hope in difficult times and how we're all essentially the same and connecting with each other. There are very few family relationships in my book. It's very much about friendship and community and people coming together with a shared purpose. So that's my book.
Lovely. And if that sounds absolutely wonderful to you watchers as well, we are doing a giveaway for a hardcover copy of the Jane Austen Society, along with a book plate signed by Natalie. And the entry form will be in the comments in the chat so that you can go ahead and enter. And it's only going to be during the video tonight. So enter now. Don't miss your chance. It's a fabulous book. So as booksellers, our back rooms are filled to bursting with advanced copies of books. And I first picked up the Jane Austen Society because there was a letter that came with the advanced copy addressed directly to me from you. And I can count on one hand the number of times an author has sent me a personal letter, and it always means so much to me. What inspired you to take on the task of sending personalized letters to booksellers when you first started promoting the Jane Austen Society?
It's funny, no one's ever asked me that question, and it's really a reflection of my team at St. Martin's Press. They bought my book in a bidding war. It was a very intense and, for me, thrilling time, and they just from that moment were so behind supporting this book. And I think that last fall, the assistant publisher and the team kind of came to me and they said, we don't want you to feel pressured at all. We don't think this is going to make a difference. But Sarah, I'll go back and tell them it did. but they said, I think having been an independent bookseller, the minute they raised the idea with me, I was like, oh, I want to do that. I want to let indie bookstore owners know how passionate I am both about their business and supporting it, but how my book is about books connecting us and giving us comfort. And I wanted to give it that personal touch, not because I was aware, as you very accurately described, of the amount of advanced reading copies that come through the door, but just because I love indie bookstores so much. I mean, I don't think you open one unless you're completely besotted. And so the idea with St. Martin's, and when they raised it with me, I just was completely on board. And, it was a lot of work and time, but never for a second did I ever regret doing that, because it gave the beginning of my publication journey just this much more personal element. And when I went on tour and got to meet with different bookstore owners before March, there was already this shorthand, this kind of like background exposure to my story. And so I think it was just a really smart marketing decision, but for me, a personally gratifying thing to do.
It was so cool, and on purple paper too. Like, it just, it was something special, and I'll always remember that. The Jane Austen Society includes two particular themes and settings that avid readers love: Jane Austen and World War II. And while it's predominantly set in the aftermath of World War II, it still has that, that feel to it that readers love. Why do you think that Jane and World War II are still such strong pulls for readers today?
That's a great question as well. I mean, I think I'll take care of the more difficult thing to articulate, which is why Jane Austen resonates still with us. And I do think that Jane Austen is a very special classical literature genius. So she was very focused on character, and she was very focused on plot. She was not as into describing the social milieu at the time in terms of history, politics, economics. There's income inequality and money are very important themes, but they continue to be, sadly, right? So wherever people live in the world. So I think what she did was she wrote in a way that immediately helped you engage with the characters and their decisions and their mistakes, their follies. But she also was providing an escape, which I think resonates with us today, because we can go into our books and project into them our own lives. We recognize people from our lives in her characters, so we can get some sense of understanding, increased understanding of our own selves and the people around us. And I think we learn things when we read her if we want to. I think we can also read her on a very surface level, and I think she also affects people at different stages of their life. So I think when you're young, there's that more romantic trope of like hate to love with Darcy and Elizabeth. Then as you get older, you start to see the appeal, and Sarah, you're too young for this, but the appeal of persuasion, the looking back and realizing that no matter what, you can always redirect course, and finding hope in that possibility. So she has ways of reaching us, I think, as well at different times in our life. So I think that's why Jane Austen still resonates with us. I think that World War II is a very special time in world history, because it's possibly the most dramatic instance of needing to win, right? Because of the Holocaust and the destruction and the evilness of the Third Reich, that this was such a black and white experience. And I think it brought everyone together to overcome this evil in their midst. And I think that is a very powerful universal theme that we still today derive hope and meaning from. And I think that historical fiction, especially World War II historical fiction, allows people to look back and to learn about these difficulties, and to see people coming out of those difficulties in a positive way, hopefully. And I think that is something that continues to give people today inspiration. And I just think World War II is a powerful example of that source of inspiration.
I studied history as well, and every time I talk to young people about getting into history, it starts with historical fiction. Yeah. And it also almost always starts with World War II historical fiction.
Yeah.
And, I think my own grandparents, lived through it. And so it's something that's always fascinated me. But I think that appeal is going to be much longer lasting than a lot of people realized.
And I hope so, because I hope that the stories and the lessons of that horrible time will never be forgotten. And I think that people will sometimes say, oh, another World War II historical fiction. But the reality is that these are very important, again, universal examples of how to live the right the better life and how to help each other and support each other. And I just think that in writing World War II historical fiction and creating these stories, we do a very small part to keep that alive. But I agree with you, and I hope that it does continue to resonate for centuries to come. Yeah,
absolutely. So the Jane Austen Society was featured in the indie bookseller curated Indie Next list. It immediately became an indie bestseller. It's been on the top of the Canadian bestseller list for weeks and weeks and weeks, and in other countries as well. How has the author journey been from you, from the very beginning to pandemic release to debut success?
Well, it's funny because I am a little old to be a debut author, so I'm in my early 50s, and I tried for decades to get published. So I always say now in interviews that I feel that the payback for the decades and the 5 different manuscripts in a drawer was, we're going to make your publication journey a little easier than it might otherwise be, because I can't honestly come up with a single complaint. Like I said, the book, I sent out the query almost on a whim after I finished it, because I had tried so hard before to get published. Nothing had happened. My agent grabbed it right away. We went on submission, and right away there was multiple publishers, interested. Then I get this amazing publisher in St. Martin's, and then I get this journey where they've done, so much support for the book, which was really necessary, I think, as a debut author, and I think really gave my book, combined with the Jane Austen sort of jet fuel, a real kind of fighting chance with the evolving world events, not just the pandemic, but everything that was happening, at the end of May onwards, right? That is just showing, so much struggle in society right now that people are really struggling and bewildered by. So I feel that, it's just a book and it's a product and it's something that people buy. But against that context, I'm really glad that it had the launch that it had. And I have, not a single complaint. I have, and my agent was like, "Are you going to keep writing?" I'd finished writing for a bit, and he's like, "Are you writing?" And this is in May, and I went, "You know what, Mitchell? No, I am going to take my pub month off. I defy you all to bother me, but I am going to take the month that my book comes out, and I'm going to enjoy every second of it. And I'm going to Google myself, and I'm going to go on Twitter, and I'm going to we're going to have champagne at dinner time. For a while, every day there was some great news, and I'm just going to enjoy it." And then right around the end of June, because my book came out the 26th of May, so it was on June 28th, and I'm like, uh-oh, I got to get back to writing. So I'm having fun. This summer's been great. I've had tons of events. I'm keeping busy and also writing as well and doing research. But I had the best pub month, let alone pub week. So it's been wonderful.
Oh, just so exciting. It's so great to hear, positive stories during all of this too. Yeah. There can still be excitements and celebrations and, just stay inside while you do it. The Jane Austen Society is inspired by the real society of the same name that was founded to save Chawton House, Austen's final dwelling. What in particular about the story of the society and the house inspired you to write? And did you seek the story out, or did you stumble upon it?
So it's interesting. I think what inspired me about the real life instance that I was sharing with you at the beginning was the fact that nobody had thought about saving this cottage until 1940, and she had passed away in 1817. The cottage had left the family. It had been subdivided into tenant flats. There were numerous people living in there, and no one was thinking about it. And all there was a plaque on the 100th anniversary of her death, centenary of her death, in 1917. They put a plaque up on the house. But other than that, there was really no marks in this village that this literary genius had lived there. And I think what I was most inspired by or attracted by was the concept of who owns history, who owns the story. If you study history, Sarah, you'll be aware of this. Who gets to tell the story? Do you have to be rich to save history? The impulse to preserve, the first person to kind of have that light bulb moment and I was really intrigued by that, because these were just regular people, in the village, and they weren't, super wealthy people, or historians or academics or, civil servants. And so that kind of was the inspiration. And then there was also that corollary of the grief that I mentioned earlier, where the gentleman who had lost his son in battle was sort of the one, the white knight, kind of came in and saved the day. They were not able to raise the money. They had run several newspaper advertisements. The British pound was taking a killing. I think it was like a quarter of the American dollar during the war, and then thereafter. So I love the idea that in his grief, the loss of a child, which is the worst grief, that he did something as a monument to his son that has had, so I get a little emotional. I've never, that has had such legs, and has just affected so many people, so that someone like me in a difficult time in life can go to Chawton and get off the train and go see these beautiful landmarks. So the other part of your question was, I think, the kind of the moment of seeking the story out or stumbling upon it. And what had happened was, and I'll try and make this part short, I'd opened my own independent bookstore about 4.5 years ago. And 4 months after opening it, my husband just gets really, out of the blue, horrific CAT scan results that he has the beginning of an incurable and terminal form of lung disease. Now, he is stable on drugs, expensive drugs, but it runs in his family. So it killed his mother and his aunt, and his brother has it. And it's one of those genetic nightmares. So then there's the fear for your child. So if this is resonating with Adeline at all in the book with you, it's that fear of multiple family members, at once. And so I had to close down the bookstore, unfortunately, because I was also a career coach, and I was working, you guys know what this is like you're working a lot of your nights and weekends, or you're ordering and your accounts, as I was doing everything. I was a one-woman operation. So I had to close down the bookstore. And I had this year where we took trips as a family. We were told at the time that most people with my husband's disease pass away within 2 to 3 years, and our daughter was only 14, and we were a young family. So we didn't know what to do at the time. Now, the good news is that he's outlived the statistics, and we really don't know how much time we have. But we're trying to live very much focused in the moment, because we don't know how much. And we took all these trips. But the other thing I did, Sarah, was I read the heck out of Jane Austen. I just read her all day long. I also watched a lot of TV. I watched a lot of Downton Abbey. I watched a lot of Cheers and Frasier. But I read a lot of Jane Austen, and then I got sucked into a rabbit hole of wanting to read about her. I felt that her story could help me somehow. She had spent many years at the end of her life in ill health and dealing with homelessness when she was younger, in the sense that they were moving between lodgings, especially after her father died. She was dependent on the largesse of her brothers. She had, many brothers, and her sister and her mother were just very dependent on who had room for them. And then she gets to this cottage in Chawton and revises or creates from scratch 6 of the greatest books ever written in a 6-7 year period, which is just nuts, right? So I'm reading about her, I'm getting really inspired, and I decide, in the middle of our trips that we're taking, I'm going to go on my own to England, and I'm going to go to the village of Chawton, and I'm going to walk in her footsteps and just spend a week immersed in her world, and just be at peace. And usually when we go, everyone's pulling me, going, when are we going to the pub? When are we going back to London? I said, no, this time I want to go, and I want to be in Chawton on my own and just do what I want. And it was really inspirational. And when I came back and my husband stabilized on these drug protocols, I remember still being, I came back, and I think they thought I would get her out of my system. I came back with a suitcase of books. They meet me at the airport. They're like, oh, good God. So then I spend the fall reading all these great books. And then, here's my Philadelphia story. So then in the spring of 2018, for my 50th birthday, there's a Jane Austen Society of North America, East Pennsylvania, Jane Austen Conference at the Merton Golf and Country Club outside of downtown Philadelphia. And my daughter and I go, and it's a day of lectures, and it's on persuasion. And one of the themes is grief in persuasion. And I'd been thinking about writing because my husband was stable and I was feeling a little bit of hope again. And I came home from that conference, and I thought about writing a book about a group of people trying to save an old British house, because I've been watching a lot of Downton Abbey. And I came home and for this conference. And a few days later, I looked up and I went, no, I'm going to write a book about a group of people that come together to save Jane Austen's house. And that was the inspiration.
That just is so exciting to me, of just the idea of traveling and experiencing her works for yourself. And my sister lived in London for a year during her grad work, and she's the biggest Austenite that I've ever met. But we always, every time we talked about it, she's like, we have to go to Bath, and we have to do this, and we have to do that. And I still tell her that, as soon as this is over, we have to travel back, because I didn't get to go to Bath. She got to go to Bath a couple of times, and I want to go to Chawton, and now she wants to go to Chawton. And so I think we're just going to have to do a sister Jane Austen trip and be like Marianne and Eleanor.
No, you should. It's so wonderful. And when I finally did, I'd been to the Jane Austen House Museum 30 years ago as an undergrad, and I would make my little backpacking trip on my own because I was born in England, and I would go back, stay with relatives. But I'd never gone inside Chawton House, which was saved by a wealthy American woman by the name of Sandy Lerner about 30 years ago, and she restored it. And then it was open to the public in 2004. We could never get inside because for the longest time it was closed on like Mondays, and we were just always in Chawton on a Monday. So part of my reason for doing this trip was I wanted to get inside Chawton House. And I think the combination of the research I had been doing, this unintentional reading and research about Jane Austen, and then finally getting in Chawton House, every room that I walked into and everything I saw is in my book. That is how incredibly inspirational my time was, in that house. And actually, as a sidebar, I don't know if I've ever shared this story actually, but one year we were there on a Monday, and I think it was I can't remember, it was March. It was on a Monday. It's about 5 or 6 years ago. And we're in the Jane Austen House Museum, and we find out Chawton House is closed, which is the main setting in my book, the house that her brother lived in, and the house that one of the characters is going to inherit in my story. And we're in the Jane Austen House Museum, and I'm all upset because you can't get into Chawton House as well. And one of the guides is talking to us, and he points to his name, and it said Jeremy Knight. And I knew right away that he was a direct descendant of Jane Austen's brother, the Knight family. And he told me, Sarah, if you guys go to the little churchyard of St. Nicholas and go to the stile at the back and peek over it, you can get a view of the house. Because up until then, you could really only see it from the road, and then you go off into a church and you can't see it anymore. So we went and we snuck through the stile, and we took all these photographs, and I made sure to put that moment in my book as well. So I'm not exaggerating. It's like everything is in my book. It's just like a big soup of travel memories.
Oh, how I have to go. I have to go.
It's worth it. Yeah.
So while Jane Austen is often considered a feminist icon, I find that she does a really good job of portraying men and their emotions as well, something I also enjoyed tremendously about the men in the Jane Austen Society. So this one is kind of twofold of, do you think readers will be surprised by the number of male fans of Austen in your story? And how did you tackle handling the taboo of men having feelings and showing emotions?
So I think I'll answer the second part first. When I write, I don't plot or outline. So I just start typing and just let whatever happens, kind of course through me. And so when I first started writing the book, the very first image was something I had done the previous fall, which is lay on the stone wall. I had my little copy of Emma, and I was feeling really sad and lonely and worried about my husband. But I was also really taking inspiration from the beauty all around me. And so when I started writing chapter 1, right away, I know this character of Adam. I just know him. He just shows up, and I right away know everything about him. And it's the same with all my characters. And at first I thought I was unique in this, but one of the great things about getting published is you have opportunities to have meaningful conversations with a lot of other writers. And I've been very happy in doing events, sometimes joint events, to discover that I'm not alone in this. And like someone, Brooke Lee Foster has a book, Summer Darlings. She was telling me, at a book club thing we did on Friday night, she was saying that her characters also just show up, and then she's always like, oh, there you are. I'm so glad, now I get to meet you. And that's how it feels. So for me, writing the men was never anything I had to be conscious of, because when they showed up, they just were completely, fully formed. And I knew everything about them right away. I knew how they would react to things. I knew how they would carry themselves. I knew what drove them. I knew kind of the stakes. I kind of knew everything about them, but I can't see their facial features. That always remains like a little fuzzy to me, like kind of like a Monet painting or something. So I never have to kind of even think about it, which I really love. I also really love a democratic, multi-character point of view novel, like Jane Austen does. I mean, I love all sorts of books, and I love first person as well, but I do love kind of getting into the heads of lots of different characters, and that's something that I've done with most of my books. I'd say there's multiple viewpoints, so I think it may be something that I've also actually developed a technique. I don't think it's all voodoo. And then the first part about your question about being surprised, perhaps the reader, in the male presence in the book, it was very intentional. So when I was doing a lot of my unintentional research, I had discovered, or had reinforced for me, that historically Jane Austen had as many male fans as women. That it was really only in the past sort of 30 years, 40 years, that in needing to have cultural shorthand for everything in the world, because everyone is very busy and the world of entertainment has to get your attention pretty fast, there has been this containment of Jane Austen in relation to things I love, Bridget Jones' Diary, the Colin Firth, Pride and Prejudice. I eat them up. I love them. But it has meant, I think, that culturally she's being kind of restricted or repurposed as a writer for women, a writer of happy endings, a writer of romance, which is, as you know, is not at all the case. So when I was doing this unintentional research, I discovered that there was this family of daughters that wrote to Jane Austen's brother, Admiral Francis Austen, in like the 1860s. They said, "We want to come over from America. We want to meet you." And we were introduced to the joys of Jane Austen by the late Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court and his former associate, Justice Story. And I remember just sitting up, because I used to be a lawyer. I remember just sitting up when I read that in this great book called Reading Austen in America by Professor Juliet Wells of Goucher College. I sat up and I just went, okay, that is so cool. A bunch of male justices on the Supreme Court passing Jane Austen back and forth. And what have we done as a society? We're losing not only our sense of that, but that men might not be turning to her in a way that might give them, reading reward and recompense. So I very much wanted to adjust. I wanted to, in my own way, reclaim her a bit for everyone. So the last thing to say in answer is that when I knew I was going to write about multiple characters, I knew right away there would be 8 to 10. And I wrote down their jobs. And I knew that they would be kind of different ages and different jobs. And I knew right away they would be evenly split, men and women. And I held to that through the writing.
It's definitely something, my husband asked me periodically what he should read. And I've had him sit through a couple different adaptations and things like that. And so I'm still waiting for him to pick up the first Austen, but he's definitely willing, which is good. That's halfway, the battle halfway.
One of the things that I appreciate about the Jane Austen Society is that while it pays ample homage to the amazing author, readers won't necessarily see it as a retelling of one of Jane's novels. Your love for her shines through, but your characters are definitely your own. How did you go about incorporating Jane's stories and characters into your book while still keeping them original to you?
Yeah, that goes back to the not plotting. So I know I'm going to have these 8 to 10 characters. And I know they're going to be evenly split, men and women, in different jobs. And they just start showing up, right? So Adam's on the stone wall. And whenever I'm writing, I'm kind of like a film director looking down, and I'm just writing down what I see happening. And I sometimes am therefore looking down. And so then it's who's looking down at him? Well, it's Mimi. Well, Marianne at the time, going to become Mimi. Then my next chapter that I wrote was actually a couple in a courtyard having tea, and they're arguing about Emma, the appeal or limited appeal of Emma. That was their first scene together. And as I'm writing this couple, I had a much bigger age difference. But as I'm writing them, I pick up on this nice spiky little vibe of attraction between them. And I realize, ooh, there's something else going on here besides healthy, rigorous debate of Jane Austen. And then I went, wait, age difference, and it would be socially inappropriate for them to fall in love. And I just remember the moment I went, it's Natalie and Emma. And that was how it happened. So I think that because it happened very spontaneously almost all the time, like it kept happening like that as I wrote. At some point, I think halfway through, it became much more intentional. But especially in the first half, as I was setting up all 8 characters, it was a very much serendipitous. And I think that helped me keep my characters' own arcs, individuality, and the plot itself organic and authentic to them as personality types, what they wanted and what was driving them. And then the fact that I could then see some parallels that I could foster through backstory or a throwaway line of dialogue became for me this really wonderful challenge of memory and resonance and remembering things that I loved about her books, and having a moment while I was writing going, oh, he has to say who cried most. That he has to say that right now. And it's just like this incredible moment where I basically copy a line from Emma. So does that answer the question?
Oh, very much so. I definitely was like halfway through, I started looking for little Easter eggs.
Yeah.
And my sister, who has a question in here actually as well, she also was like, oh, and then this was connected to this book. And I was like, oh, so it was like even more exciting to find more, because she knows way more than me. So Mimi, who we have mentioned, a Hollywood actress, plays a crucial role in the Jane Austen Society. But back in the States, she has to contend with Hollywood creeps and their actions, the same actions that inspired the Me Too movement. When you were writing her backstory, did current movements play a role in how you presented her handling of them?
Oh, yeah, very, very much so. I mean, I think a lot of what I wrote about was very affected by, in terms of Mimi's storyline, I think it couldn't have been more affected by the Me Too movement. So in that quiet year of doing a lot of reading, I had also been reading old Hollywood actress memoirs and biographies. I've always just found them also very meaningful. I learned something about how people have lived the arc of their life. And I find them fascinating. So I read a lot about Ava Gardner, Elizabeth Taylor, Katharine Hepburn, Grace Kelly, and I always forget, there's a 5th one in there that I forget. So, Barbara Stanwyck. So I had read a lot about these women. So then the Me Too movement happened, and I was very affected by it, like all women. And I remember being particularly affected by the stories of women actresses who had their careers completely obliterated. And I would look at my husband and I'd go, oh yeah, remember we were watching that movie? And we were like, whatever happened to that girl? And then you realize, and I got so upset. So then 6 months later, when I'm writing my book, I was thinking about this Hollywood actress, because who would have the means to acquire these items at auction? Who could it be? And I was thinking about her, and I was thinking about what would make her want to leave behind this very unusual, rich, exciting life. And I knew in that moment that she was going to run into the kind of person that would violate you and affect you in such a horrible way that you would be willing to give up your career, which is so extreme, right? And so I was, and sorry if I sound quite, emotional about it, but I was very angry and affected. And so I wanted to kind of explore that. So yeah, very much affected by it. On a happier, less serious note, I guess. The other thing that empowered me to include a Hollywood actress in my book was the story of Kelly Clarkson of American Idol, talk show host, is an Austen lover and had actually acquired the turquoise ring at auction at Sotheby's in 2013 and generously sold it back to the nation of England and to the Jane Austen House Museum so they could keep it in the country. But I remember reading that story as well. And it had always stayed with me, if you had the means, what would you do with it, And, so behind me, I have like some of these like older books. I don't know if you can see them in the camera, but, and it's a bit of a rabbit hole. Like, my husband gave me this beautiful 1906 Emma as a publication present. I got it a little late. I just got it this week. And then I was like, he's like, oh, they also have Pride and Prejudice. And I'm like, my eyebrow goes up. It's just like, so it's wonderful to be in a position to explore collecting things, So that was the other element I think about the Hollywood storyline that I would share. Yeah.
it's such a moving storyline, and the decisions that Mimi makes are, I just cheer for her louder and louder and louder.
Yeah.
But I'm a huge fan of all of the members of the society, and I had certain favorite character interactions that I always found myself looking forward to. As the author, were there any favorite relationships or interactions that you found particularly enjoyable to write?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I did love Dr. Gray and Adeline. They were my ship. I was like, I remember writing it and going, are they going to get back together? No, I'm going to make them suffer. Like, I was always like playing with those two like chess pieces. That was really fun. I really loved Adam. Adam gets to open and close the story for a reason, because through Adam, I got to channel not only my time in Chawton when I was feeling so sad and lonely myself, but also the experience of first falling in love with Jane Austen. And you're going, what's the big deal? And you start to read the book, and suddenly you're like, whoa, like your brain kind of explodes. Right? It's this wonderful feeling, and you get it, and then you want more. And so Adam, also being shy and introverted, and clearly not shy or introverted, but I think most of us have a shy side, and I think that I loved seeing somebody who came at social connection and relationships from such a damaged, insecure, or, I don't know, tamped down kind of position, and basically flower through the course of the book, like basically put himself into little situations that are outside his comfort zone. And that's all you can do, right? And then finally, I really loved Evie. Evie is really an homage to my daughter. She's the only character that really has a connection to anyone real. I loved Evie. I loved her chutzpah and her single-minded academic ambition, which is something that I had and that my daughter has. And I also loved Evie's spirit in the sense that having to leave school when she was 14, I never made the connection before Sarah until about a month ago. It was that my mother had to leave school when she was 14. And I never made the connection that the age was the same, which is how the writer brain, I think, works sometimes. And my mother is like the best, human being I've ever met. But with Evie, I love that she's been given this plate of bad luck. And she's just like, nope, I'm not going to take that. I'm going to figure this out. And I'm going to do it on my own. And I'm going to do it without any expectation or promise of reward. And that's also the writer's life. And so I think that Evie, I feel this bond with her for her perseverance and her resilience in keeping going for 2 years in that library with no assurance of anything.
That library project she undertakes definitely reminds me of my own every time I've moved with all of my books. Every time trying to figure out how to rearrange them, and this is actually one of 5 bookcases in this room with multiple piles still on the floor. So still a year after living here, still trying to figure that project out. Yeah. So I was like, if she can do it, I can do it.
Absolutely.
As audiobooks take off in popularity, we've definitely seen increased requests for them at the store, but we really, as booksellers, don't know much about the process for audiobooks. And you have Richard Armitage of The Hobbit and British television fame reading the audiobook, which is just amazing. And did you have any, involvement in the process? How did you react? What was that like? Tell us, please.
So I'm doing my first Twitter giveaway today, which is a copy of the audiobook. So it's been one of the best parts of the journey, because I didn't know when I got the deal that there would be a large print book and an audiobook, and there's all these elements. So what happened was that a good friend and a Jane Austen expert, Laurel Ann Natras, and who wrote a book or edited a book called Jane Austen Made Me Do It, and has a blog called Austen Prose. She and I share an agent, and from earliest days she got to see the manuscript. She was such a huge supporter, and we would blue sky and chat about, if he ever gets to make it into a movie, Richard Armitage should be Dr. Gray, and if they ever do an audiobook. And so we had bandied Vaseline together, and then flash forward like a year, and it's time to pick a narrator. And this is just before Christmas of this past year. And I was given 4 lovely female narrators, and they were wonderful. They had connections to famous Jane Austen productions. They were all great. But Sarah, as I said earlier, like, my characters are split, men and women. And when I first looked at the list of women, the first thing I thought to myself was, why are we assuming it has to be a female narrator? And I called my agent and I said, does it have to be a female narrator? And he's like, why? Like, what are you thinking? I went, well, I've just gone through the book, and there are more scenes that involve just a man or a man in conversation with another man than there are scenes with just a woman or, two women together. And he's like, ooh, well, what are you thinking? And in that moment, I just decided to go for it. And I went, well, Richard Armitage. And fortunately, he had done my UK publisher and Orion, Hachette, and Macmillan in the States were partnering together on the audiobook. They had access to his team. He had done audiobooks for them in the past. He had also done Georgette Heyer, this sort of like modern Regency novelist. And I think that got people's head around the fact that he could do female voices really well. And so my agent was like, well, we'll see. And yeah, then I found out that he said yes. And then I had to sit on it for like 3 months. I thought I would die. And I told my mother, and she's like one of his biggest fans. And it's the only secret my mother has ever kept. But I think that she knew that if she said anything, it could like torpedo the whole thing. So she behaved like really well and kept it secret for a really long time too. It was wonderful. When I first heard it, I think the last thing to say about audiobooks is Libro FM. If you buy the audiobook through Libro, the part of the proceeds will go to the independent bookstore, right? That you demarket through. Yeah. And one of the great things about an audiobook as a writer is that I didn't think there was anything new to come, but he gave Yardley Sinclair a Scottish accent. Of course he did, but I never had that in my head when I was writing, because he was a London Sotheby's auctioneer, and I wasn't really thinking about the last name. I admit that, because this is like, it doesn't look like I'm very brilliant, but he was so creative. But also when he did the interior monologues, so when Adeline is starting to get very worried about her inability to cope, and she's surprised at her inability to cope, where Dr. Gray's in the graveyard at Christmas time, he's really struggling with some of the bad choices that he's making. Richard Armitage as a narrator brought me to tears hearing him do those sections, and I never cried writing those scenes, or in the many times I've had to read them over for whatever reason. But he could bring me to tears because he was elevating it with his talent as an actor. And that gave me as a writer a whole new appreciation for what actors do. And it just made me so grateful that he was the one that got to do my book. Yeah.
Such a great, thank you. Because I never really knew about the audiobook process, and just to have him do it, and the important point of, the split of the characters and having a male narrator, it's just amazing. So this next question is from my sister. And she says, we're all worried about Chawton House and how it will survive with the current pandemic. Is there anything that you know of that fellow Austen enthusiasts can do to help ensure that it lasts for at least another 80 plus years?
Yes. I mean, I love that question. So the first thing is just to donate as little or as much as you can, but to donate, even if it's just $5. So there's actually an organization set up in North America called the North American Friends of Chawton House. They're a registered charity, so you would get the charitable donation receipt if it's over the threshold. And their money goes straight to Chawton House. Like it's basically just a way for North Americans to donate and get the tax, deductions. So I actually recently made a donation there. I should let you guys know, I don't always, mention this, but 5% of my share of my net UK royalties are going to Chawton House. So that was for my UK book. So that's how much I care about it. But also, I'm very conscious of how we really do have to give money to the places that depend on tourist dollars. They have very little other means for money. And the Jane Austen's House Museum just had to do urgent appeal for £75,000, and they managed to raise, I think, 95,000 in just a few days. But they were going to have to close before the end of the year, which is, for me, was a horrible day because I think it was in the middle for me of, hitting some bestseller lists and everything's going great. And then the very thing that inspired my book and that I love so much, the museum, and then eventually Chawton House, the fact that they could be imperiled all over again was almost too much for me on an emotional level. And so I immediately made, I think, like a $3,000 US donation to Jane Austen's House Museum because I just didn't know what else to do. But people were donating on the GoFundMe version, $5, $10. It doesn't have to be a lot. But I've mentioned the amounts that I gave because I just want people to understand that that's how dire I think the situation is, and that. So I think they need the money, and then they need us all when we get there to go visit. Yeah.
Well, it's very much top of my list.
Yeah.
So that's all really my Jane Austen Society specific questions. But I'm wondering what's up next for you.
So I'm working on my next book. I'm in the first draft of the WIP, and I'm also doing research at the same time. It's historical fiction. Again, it's set this time in the 1950s in England, and I can't say much more else, but it takes place mainly in, Sarah, are you sitting down? A bookshop. Don't tell anyone I told you guys.
Lips are sealed, I promise. I love anytime a book takes place in a bookshop, just like I will read it without knowing anything more about it. And especially an English bookshop, I think Jenny Colgan's Bookshop series and Sean Blythell's Confessions of a Bookseller about Wigtown, just the more bookshop stories in Britain, the happier I am as a person and a bookseller.
So I know that I have one sale. Yeah, no, it's so much fun. I love writing, and I love that. And then my book came out at the end of May, and it's now August. So it's been this incredible journey, but I'm so looking forward to the fall and just continuing to write and do research at this sort of the same time, which is, I like to do it that way. Because I don't like, Sarah, a last thing to say is, I don't like the research dominating the text. So I try to stay very focused on the characters and what their individual stories are. And the research is to enhance that. But I don't want to cut my characters or their individual stories to fit themes or things that happened. So I like to kind of keep it fluid that way and responsive to each other.
I think you do a wonderful job of that in the Jane Austen Society, and I can't wait to read your next book. So thank you, Natalie, so much for being here with us this evening. And thank you, everyone, for watching. We're really excited to have you swing by the store and grab a copy.